Discussions of the character of the war in Ukraine have increasingly adopted terms such as stalemate and attritional to describe the state of the conflict. Both terms draw parallels with the Western Front of the First World War that are not wholly inaccurate, but that can be misleading if taken too far. The current war in Ukraine is certainly not stalemated in the sense of having reached a point where neither side can make further progress. Nor is it, properly speaking, attritional. An attritional war is one which attrition itself is the victory mechanism. In the Battle of Verdun, for example, the Germans indeed pursued an explicitly attritional campaign to deplete the French reserves. But neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are currently seeking to win by imposing greater losses on the adversary. They are rather engaged in a kind of war best described as positional. A positional war is characterized by relatively static front lines and regular combat that produces little movement. The aim of such combat is generally either to make small gains or to create conditions to restore maneuver on the battlefield. Alexander Svechin offers the most detailed theory on positional warfare in his 1926 book with the simple title Strategy. Svechin's book had a significant influence on Soviet and post-Soviet military thought. Almost a century after its publication, it offers an important corrective to our understanding of the current conflict in Ukraine and its likely trajectories. Former Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny assessed in a November 2023 essay for The Economist that the war in Ukraine had reached a phase of positional warfare. This concept of positional warfare is ill-defined and poorly understood in Western military thought. Positional warfare doesn't mean a stalemate, but is instead often a temporary phase of warfare characterized by relatively static front lines and attacks that generate only small gains. It contrasts with maneuver warfare, in which combatants seek to penetrate enemy defensive lines and exploit those penetrations by making large, rapid gains using mechanized formations. Combatants in a positional war can still achieve tactical and strategic battlefield effects through localized engagements, but they often rightly focus on seeking to restore maneuver. Although Svechin never explicitly defines the concept of positional warfare in his book, he does provide an overview of the factors that lead to positional warfare, the combat that characterizes it, and how commanders can break positional fronts. Positional warfare is the product of both external and internal conditions. Svechin identifies the objectives and capabilities of the combatants as the two primary factors that can lead a war to assume a positional form. Battlefield commanders pursue either positive or negative objectives. Positive objectives seek to alter the status quo and are offensive, whereas negative objectives seek to deny the enemy ability to pursue positive objectives. There are two possible positive objectives in positional warfare: applying pressure on the enemy while maintaining the positional front, or conducting operations intended to restore maneuver on the battlefield. Svechin also posits that negative objectives can contribute to a strategic defense, which he argues requires a balance between defending against enemy attacks and conserving resources. Pursuing negative objectives increases the likelihood that the war will take on a positional form, and it becomes near certain if both sides pursue negative goals. Missing capabilities and the inability to pursue positive goals can additionally contribute to a positional front. Material shortages on one or more sides of the conflict may cause combatants to exhaust their offensive capabilities and enter positional fighting. Svechin argues that modern technologies, primarily railroads and modern communications, promoted the development of positional fronts in the First World War. Rail lines ensured that large masses of forces on the defensive could move faster and farther than attackers advancing on foot, making it easier for military commands to create and maintain defensive fronts capable of defending against enemy breakthroughs. On the other hand, early 20th century communications technology favors static positions by requiring fixed lines for telephonic communications. Geographic features of a theater can also make positional warfare less likely. Smaller countries lacking strategic depth and extensive rear areas are unable to generate the resources necessary to sustain a positional front for an extended period. A defense requires expendable territory and time, and larger countries can afford to lose ground temporarily, whereas smaller countries will depend on external assistance for defense. Generating the required mass to prevent a breakthrough and pursue positive goals becomes easier when a combatant possesses the requisite industrial depth and rear areas to support its war effort. Capabilities, objectives, geography, and general technology thus determine the onset of positional warfare. Positional warfare is characterized by localized engagements and attritional battles, which can generate tactical and strategic effects in positional warfare, even in the context of relatively static front lines. Forces fighting on positional fronts use fortifications and mass to prevent the enemy from achieving positive goals, and Svechin describes each combatant as trying to lean on the front of the enemy. The presence of static lines and the absence of maneuver are essential elements of Svechin's conception of positional warfare. Static lines don't mean that combat itself is not dynamic, nor that combatants cannot achieve advantage or initiative through this combat. Local battles are tactical engagements aimed at disrupting the calm from which the enemy may otherwise benefit. These efforts can include night raids and sniper fire, which make it more difficult for the enemy to operate successfully in forward defensive lines. Svechin argues that these efforts can inflict significant casualties and force the enemy to increase the force density across the front. Local battles can't individually achieve operational or strategic effects. Combatants instead pursue strategic objectives on a positional front through a series of so-called material battles, which is in essence attrition warfare. A combatant conducting material battle destroys enemy forces through favorable relative attrition rather than through maneuver warfare, and seeks to deny the enemy the opportunity to develop an operational or strategic reserve. A positional front requires less personnel and material to maintain than would be necessary for extensive maneuver operations. This allows a commander to create strategic reserves that will attempt to break the positional front later. Positional warfare allows the high military command to make operational-level decisions because the reduced tempo of operations allows time for information to reach the high command and orders to reach the front without the battlefield conditions changing significantly. Decisions from an over-centralized high military command will likely come too late for the rapid pace of maneuver warfare, but the reduced tempo of positional warfare allows the high command to bypass and even undermine frontline commanders should the high command choose to do so. Secondary sectors behind a positional front can play a crucial role. A combatant tends to focus on the geographical value of a certain area because of its logistics or topographical features, since the difference between the sectors are otherwise diminished compared to periods of maneuver warfare. These features, such as an industrial center, critical road junction, or rail line, compel a combatant to protect these sectors of the front more than other sectors. Combatants may wish to avoid fighting on a positional front for an extended period of time due to its costly nature. The alternative is to restore maneuver on the battlefield. A combatant can exploit geography to help restore maneuver. For example, withdrawing to more favorable ground invites the opponent to enter less defensible terrain, where maneuver is easier to achieve, and positional fronts are harder to stabilize. In case of a breakthrough, a combatant may easily wreck the enemy's command and control structure and logistics organization if the enemy has over-centralized the military command and restricted logistics infrastructure to optimize excessively for positional warfare. Positional fronts may create the opportunity to fix large amounts of the enemy's forces by using a smaller force, allowing the combatant to use freed-up troops to achieve operational successes elsewhere. Svechin emphasizes the need for comprehensive modifications across all levels of a force's structure to take advantage of these possibilities. This approach applies to frontline tactics, logistics, and command and control. The military command must align the tactical training of its forces with the command's strategic goals to restore maneuver. A combatant may also disrupt positional fronts by utilizing terrain that previously was not part of the battlefield. The outbreak of World War II saw a significant shift towards mobile warfare tactics, but positional warfare still played a crucial role in many battles and campaigns. Possibly the best example is the fighting along the Volkhov Front, including the Siege of Leningrad. The terrain consisted of wooded areas and swamps that restricted movement and made the combatants to lean more towards positional fighting. After the success of the German Tikhvin offensive, the Soviets launched their first counterattack in the sector and forced the Germans to abandon Tikhvin and form a defensive line on terrain that was easier to defend. Both sides had built fortifications, and Army Group North spent the remainder of the war in the background of the Eastern Front without conducting large-scale offensives. Fighting continued along the Volkhov Front until Army Group North retreated behind the Panther Line in February of 1944. Another example from the Eastern Front is the Battle of Stalingrad. As the 6th Army approached the city, the tempo of the attack decreased until the advance deteriorated into brutal house-to-house fighting. Here we see once again Alexander Svechin's theory of tying down enemy forces to allow for the creation of a strategic reserve elsewhere. When the Soviet 62nd Army retreated into the city, it had been reduced to just 20,000 personnel. Meanwhile, the Soviets concentrated their forces in the steppes north and south of the city. The secondary sectors on the German side were guarded by ill-equipped Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations. The Red Army restored maneuver on the battlefield by striking at the flanks of the 6th Army, where the Axis forces had neglected for months to consolidate their positions, and in just 4 days, the Soviets had completely encircled more than 250,000 Axis troops. As mentioned earlier, small countries that lack the advantage of strategic depth can't engage in positional warfare for an extended period of time and rely on external assistance for a strategic defense. And in no other country was this more obvious than in Greece. The mountainous terrain of Greece favors a defensive strategy. In 1936, the Greeks started the construction of a chain of fortifications that came to be known as the Metaxas Line. Located in Macedonia, the line was designed to protect the country from a potential Bulgarian invasion. However, Italy invaded Greece from its bases in Albania. This forced the Greek command to withdraw forces from Macedonia and leave the Metaxas Line undermanned. External assistance was provided by Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. 4 days after the arrival of British troops, the Germans started preparations for an invasion through northern Greece. The Germans had to break the Metaxas Line in order to capture Thessaloniki, Greece's second-largest city and a strategically important port. The Greek commander-in-chief, Alexandros Papagos, insisted to take advantage of the Metaxas Line, but General Wilson, who commanded the Allied forces in Greece, argued that the front in the north is too broad, and instead took defensive positions in the Haliakmon Valley along a narrow front. Withdrawing from the Metaxas Line would surrender all of northern Greece without a fight, which was unacceptable for the Greeks, and so the Greek army fought along the Metaxas Line with 4 ill-equipped divisions. Even so, the Greeks inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans and held almost all fortresses until the 2nd Panzer Division broke through and occupied Thessaloniki, at which point they surrendered under orders of their commander.
Thessaloniki ist in deutscher Hand. Hier war im Weltkrieg das Hauptquartier der Alliierten. Jetzt ist dieser wichtige Hafen schon nach 4,5 Tagen von unseren Truppen erobert.
At Monte Cassino, the combatants engaged in dynamic positional fighting for almost 4 months, which involved both infantry and tank assaults, aerial bombings, river crossings, mountain warfare, and close-quarters combat, including the fighting on Castle Hill, which was reminiscent of medieval siege warfare. The secondary sector that affected the course of the battle was at Anzio, where the Allies launched an amphibious assault that would force the Germans to pull troops out of the Gustav Line. Despite the many mistakes in the Allied planning, the failed assaults at Monte Cassino set the conditions for the eventual breakthrough when the weather improved. In the days following the breakthrough, 2,000 tanks and 20,000 vehicles of different types passed through the Liri Valley, and with the German 10th Army in full retreat, the U.S. 5th Army entered Rome on June 4, 1944. The Battle of Normandy is an ideal example where technology and secondary sectors affected both sides of the conflict in different ways. As the Allied infantry was making marginal gains every day through the hedgerows, engineers and tank crews invented cutting devices that would allow tanks to breach the hedgerows and restore battlefield mobility. The result was the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter, named so after Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division, who is generally credited as the inventor of the device. The Germans, on the other hand, had a limited stockpile of V-1 and V-2 rockets that could potentially be used against the Normandy beachheads. The V-rocket program was still in its early stages, however, and the rockets lacked a sophisticated guidance system that would make them suitable for precision strikes against military targets. Nevertheless, we see how secondary sectors behind the front line become increasingly important, and we can only imagine the disruption that precise rocket strikes would cause in the Allied operations. The Allies, for their part, enjoyed total air superiority and found it easier to attack radar installations, airfields, supply lines, and reinforcements that were on their way to the front. In the case of Ukraine, we witnessed how both the Ukrainians and the Russians pursued positive objectives until their offensive capabilities were exhausted and the war took a positional form. Since then, both sides have been seeking solutions to their respective problems to restore mobility on the battlefield. The Russians broke the positional front at Avdiivka after the fall of the settlement and began to restore maneuver because of the delays in the provision of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. However, on June 7, 2024, Russian President Vladimir Putin articulated a theory of victory that assumes that Russian forces will be able to continue gradual creeping advances indefinitely, prevent Ukraine from conducting successful counteroffensive operations, and win a war of attrition against Ukraine. President Putin's theory of victory rests on Russia's ability to outlast and overcome pledged Western security assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainian efforts to mobilize more of its economy and population for the war effort. In his essay, General Zaluzhny recognizes that a war of attrition in this case benefits Russia, and that in order to break out of positional warfare, Ukraine must gain air superiority, breach mine barriers in depth, increase the effectiveness of counter-battery, create and train the necessary reserves, and build up electronic warfare capabilities. The arrival of Western-provided aid to the front lines allowed Ukrainian forces to stabilize critical areas of the front. In July 2024, senior NATO and U.S. defense officials assessed that Ukrainian forces will continue to be on the defensive until 2025. In select sectors of the front, however, Ukrainian forces already attempted to contest the tactical initiative in limited counterattacks, especially since Western security assistance began to arrive in Ukraine at scale. Finally, on August 6 of 2024, Ukrainian forces suddenly launched a cross-border mechanized assault into Kursk. The lack of a coherent Russian response to the Ukrainian incursion and the reported rate of Ukrainian advance indicates that Ukrainian forces were able to achieve operational surprise along the border with Russia. The Ukrainians changed the terms of the battle by striking into an area that was previously not part of the battlefield, where maneuver is easier to achieve and where positional fronts are harder to stabilize because of the lack of fortifications. The Russian military's continued inability to prevent rapid Ukrainian maneuver following the operational surprise that Ukrainian forces achieved at the outset of the operation in Kursk Oblast indicates that there are enduring exploitable Russian vulnerabilities along the international border with Ukraine. The persisting issues with Russian command and control in Kursk will also further complicate Russia's ability to prevent rapid Ukrainian maneuver and quickly respond to any other possible Ukrainian cross-border incursions. Poor Russian communication, unclear delineation of responsibilities, and subpar coordination for reconnaissance and fire between Russian units along the border will likely create gaps that highly maneuverable Ukrainian groups can exploit. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces struggled to achieve operational surprise in 2024 due to the partially transparent battlefield in Ukraine. Ukraine's ability to achieve operational surprise highlights that the widespread visual and sensor-based transparency that both sides have established does not translate into a fully transparent battlefield, however, and that the belligerents in Ukraine can leverage ambiguity around operational intent to achieve operational surprise. Positional warfare, as conceptualized in Alexander Svechin's strategy, is a phase of warfare that, while geographically static, creates dynamic opportunities and risks. This conception is incongruent with the modern connotations of strategic paralysis that the concepts positional warfare and static front can evoke. Local battles on a positional front can be key to shaping later operational success. Attritional battles can achieve strategic effects and allow a combatant to seize the battlefield advantage without breaking a positional front. The centralized command and control that benefits positional fighting can increase the likelihood of the operational and strategic success of an initial breakthrough for a well-prepared and organized combatant. Both foreseen and unforeseen factors contribute to the development of a positional front in the war, but a positional front is not necessarily permanent or static despite its difficulties. Svechin notes that it's easy to get involved in positional warfare, even against one's will, but it's not so easy to get out of it. This fact has given positional warfare a reputation of extreme difficulty and permanence. Svechin's arguments in strategy add nuance and depth to the concept of positional warfare, particularly for contemporary Western military thinkers, acting as a reminder that positional warfare can be broken, allowing a combatant to resume maneuver warfare and achieve significant operational successes.